Southwestern Libya, a rock shelter called Takarkori, 5,000 years before the Common Era, which means 7,000 years before now. 2 women are buried here. Their hair is still intact. Their bone collagen has held. And in April of 2025, a team from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig extracted their genomes and found something that, by every model we had, should not be there. The Sahara outside that cave was green. There were lakes, cattle, ibis moving across grasslands that would eventually become the largest desert on Earth. The women inside raised animals, made pottery, left behind evidence of hierarchy and ceremony. They were not primitive, they were a civilization, and their DNA pointed somewhere that made no sense. Not to sub-Saharan Africa, even though they were in Africa, not to the Near East, not to any population that left a footprint we recognize. Their lineage connected, at its deepest root, to the ancestral population that would eventually produce the farmers who built Neolithic Europe. In Africa. 7,000 years ago, Dr. Nada Salem and Professor Johannes Krause led that study. Their team published the results in Nature in April 2025. What they found was a lineage that had split from all other human populations approximately 50,000 years ago, at the exact same moment our species was beginning to leave Africa. But this population didn't leave, it stayed. And it remained genetically sealed, no meaningful exchange with sub-Saharan populations, no Near Eastern influx for the entire span of prehistory. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. This lineage, this ancient North African ghost population, is not detectable in any living person currently residing in North Africa. The civilization that sat at the genetic crossroads of Europe and Africa, that lived through the most habitable period the Sahara has ever seen, that buried its dead in caves overlooking green savanna, that civilization no longer has living descendants that we can find. Somewhere between then and now, the original was erased. If you've ever genuinely wondered where you actually come from, not the family story, not the ethnicity estimate, but the real biological chain of transmission going back 50,000 years, then subscribe. Because what I'm about to show you goes much further back than most people are prepared to look. The lineage is gone from North Africa, but it didn't disappear. It went somewhere. And where it went is going to force you to reconsider something you thought you understood. Actually, hold on. Before we go further, drop something in the comments for me. Where is your family from? North Africa? Southern Europe? The Near East? Sub-Saharan Africa? Anywhere. Just one line. Because by the end of this video, you may be looking at that answer differently than you do right now. Eastern Morocco. A cave near Oujda called Grotte des Pigeons. 1908. A French colonial surveyor finds a burial culture and names it Ibero-Maurusian, after Iberia, which he assumes is the origin. He was wrong in every direction, but the mistake stuck, and the real story of who these people were waited more than a century to be told. In 2018, Dr. Marika van de Loosdrecht of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany, extracted nuclear DNA from 7 individuals at a site called Tafaralt in that same region of Morocco. The samples were 15,000 years old. 15,000. It was the oldest nuclear DNA ever recovered from anywhere in Africa. What her team found: roughly 2/3 of these people's ancestry traced to Natufians, hunter-gatherers from the Levant, the ancient Near East, and 1/3 traced to sub-Saharan Africa. Specifically, the closest modern matches were the Hadza of Tanzania and certain West African populations. But here's where it gets strange. The match wasn't exact. The sub-Saharan signal in these 15,000-year-old Moroccans doesn't correspond precisely to any living population on Earth. The source group, the specific people who contributed 1/3 of North Africa's genome at the end of the Ice Age, has left no confirmed living descendants. Genetically speaking, that branch is extinct. Think about what that means. 42 individuals have been recovered from Tafaralt. Every one of them carries a signal that was fired into the future from a population that no longer exists in recognizable form. It's not that they disappeared suddenly. It's that the precise combination of markers they carried, that 1/3 of the ancient North African genome, has no return address. The Ibero-Maurusian people made tools of extraordinary precision. Stone microliths, small enough to hold between 2 fingers, shaped with patience and technical knowledge that took generations to develop. They chose this cave for their dead, which means they had a concept of sacred space, of permanence, of meaning after death. And the third of their genome that came from the south left the record like a letter posted from an address that no longer exists. The lineage is gone. But something carried it forward. And the question of where it went is the question this entire video is built around. Exists. That's the word. The question is where? Stuttgart, Germany, 2014. A genetics laboratory at the Max Planck Institute. Dr. Josef Lazaridis, then a research fellow at Harvard Medical School, is running Ancestry models on a 7,000-year-old farmer recovered near that city. The model keeps producing a third component. It isn't European. It isn't Near Eastern, not exactly. It's something older than both, and it has no name in any reference panel that existed at the time. Lazaridis and his colleagues published the results in Nature that same year. They showed that modern Europeans descend from at least 3 ancestral populations: Western hunter-gatherers, ancient North Eurasians, and early European farmers. And the early European farmers, the people who carried agriculture into Europe from Anatolia, harbored approximately 44% of their ancestry from what the team named Basal Eurasians. A ghost, a population that had branched off from all other non-African lineages before those lineages separated from each other. A group that had been isolated so completely for so long that they missed the event that left a biological mark on virtually every other human being outside of Africa. That event was Neanderthal admixture. Every person of non-African descent alive today carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, somewhere between 1 and 4%, picked up when modern humans and Neanderthals overlapped in Europe and Western Asia. But Basal Eurasians have almost none, which means only one thing. Their ancestors were not present at that overlap. They were somewhere else, somewhere isolated, somewhere between North Africa and the southern Levant, the exact geographic zone where the Tafaralt foragers and the Takarkori women lived and died. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the simple model predicted. The straightforward version of this story is humans leave Africa, spread into Eurasia, mix with Neanderthals, eventually become Europeans. Clean, linear, done. The Basal Eurasian finding breaks that model at its base. There was at least one major human lineage that exited Africa, or stayed near its margins, and remained separate from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years. Then, through the Neolithic farming migration, that lineage entered Europe. It built the megaliths, it farmed the first European fields. It became, in a measurable genomic sense, the backbone of what we now call Western ancestry. And here's the part that the ancestry testing industry has never fully reckoned with. Commercial DNA tests calculate your African or European percentages against reference populations, living people sampled today. But the Basal Eurasian source population doesn't exist as a living group to sample. That means every ancestry estimate you've ever seen is running its calculation against an incomplete baseline. The zero is wrong. The test is measuring against a reference that's missing its most important chapter, 0. That is the number of detectable sub-Saharan African ancestors that the Takarkori women had. Despite living during the wettest, most biologically open period the Sahara had seen in recorded history, 8,000 years before the Common Era. The Central Sahara is unrecognizable by any modern standard. Lake Megachad covers an area the size of the Caspian Sea. Hippopotami move through rivers cutting across what is now Niger. There are people with cattle and pottery and ochre paintings living across a landscape that will eventually become the most hostile desert on Earth. Scientists call this the African Humid Period. It lasted 9,500 years. 9,500 years. The Roman Empire lasted 5 centuries. The European Union is 32 years old. This biological corridor between North and Sub-Saharan Africa stayed open, green, and traversable for an interval 20 times longer than all of Western recorded history. And according to the 2025 Takarkori study, led by Dr. Nada Salem and Professor Johannes Krause, the populations on either side of it mostly didn't use it. That isn't geography. Geography was removed. The barrier was gone. And still, the genomes didn't mix. Professor Krause stated directly in the published findings, despite the Sahara's transformation into a lush, habitable landscape, Gene flow between sub-Saharan and North African groups remained minimal. What we are looking at, in genomic terms, is a social boundary that survived the removal of its geographic foundation. Whatever was keeping these populations separate was not the sand. The sand was gone. Something else remained. And this is where the story turns in a direction nobody anticipated. Look at the Tafaralt individuals from 15,000 years before the Common Era, before the Green Sahara, when the corridor was far less accessible. They carried 1/3 sub-Saharan ancestry. Then the Sahara opened up, the road became easy, and the exchange slowed down. Before the highway existed, people crossed it. After the highway was built, they stopped. That is not a migration story. That is a behavioral one. Everything I just told you, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. Because the same 2025 research that confirmed the Takarkori isolation found something in a Tunisian burial site that shattered the timeline from the opposite direction. While everyone assumed the Neolithic farming wave was the first major genetic contact between Africa and Europe, a different population had already made the crossing, going the wrong way, 3,000 years earlier. Backwards. That is the only word for what European DNA is doing in a Tunisian burial site 8,000 years before the Common Era. Jebba, northern Tunisia, 8,000 BCE. A person is buried here with posture and grave goods consistent with older North African forager traditions. They look, archaeologically, like everyone around them. Then in 2025, Dr. Mark Lipson at Harvard University and Professor David Reich at Harvard Medical School published a study in Nature that analyzed 9 individuals from Algeria and Tunisia. The Jebba individual was unlike everyone else in their data by approximately 3,000 years of genetic history. This person carried ancestry from Western European hunter-gatherers, a lineage with no known North African source. Lipson and Reich concluded that this individual represents movement across the Strait of Sicily from Europe into North Africa in the early Holocene, at a time when no large-scale agricultural wave had yet moved in any direction. The Strait of Sicily, at its narrowest, is 148 kilometers. That is not an ocean. It is, by any measure of ancient seafaring capability, a manageable crossing. We have evidence of maritime activity in the Mediterranean going back at least 10,000 years. And yet the model that has been taught, the timeline that says European-African genetic contact began with the Neolithic farming wave, has never accounted for someone who crossed before the farming wave existed. This isn't just ancient history, this is in your DNA right now. If you carry Southern European ancestry, Spanish, Italian, Sicilian, Sardinian, Maltese, the genetic conversation between that peninsula and North Africa began earlier than any textbook you've ever read acknowledges. The Jebba individual crossed, lived, died, and was buried in Tunisia. Their descendants, or their cousins' descendants, or the population they represent, may have eventually blended into the very North African forager lineage that would contribute to the pre-Neolithic Maghrebi profile. The Mediterranean was a two-way road. It always was. We just now have the genomic receipt, and the Lipson-Reich study confirmed something else about the populations surrounding that lone Jebba individual. The earliest Algerians and Tunisians in their dataset, covering the period from 15,000 to 7,600 years before present, clustered tightly with pre-Neolithic Western Moroccan populations. The Maghrebi genetic profile was stable, coherent, and geographically widespread. These were not isolated pockets. This was a population with deep roots and clear borders, borders that had nothing to do with geography. But the farming wave was coming, and what it did to North Africa depended almost entirely on which side of a mountain range you happened to live on. African cargo, moving through Anatolian ships, arriving on European shores, and then, the model says, gone. But it wasn't gone, it came back. And what happened when it returned is the strangest part of this entire story. 7,500 years ago, something happened in northwest Morocco that Dr. Rosa Friegel, then at Complutense University in Madrid, and her colleagues documented in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2018. Neolithic farmers from the Iberian Peninsula crossed into North Africa. These weren't the original Anatolian farmers. They were their descendants, already transformed by several thousand years of European exposure. They brought wheat, domesticated animals, and a genome that had spent 10 millennia traveling from the Near East through Anatolia into Spain and back across the water. And here's what that means. Those Iberian Neolithic farmers, in their genome, still carried a modified version of the Basal Eurasian signal, the ancient North African ghost lineage that had fed into the Near Eastern farming cultures thousands of years earlier. When they crossed back into Morocco, they were, in a measurable genomic sense, bringing a copy of Africa back to Africa. The original had stayed, the copy had traveled through Anatolia, through Europe, through 1,000 years of admixture, and was now returning home, unrecognizable, carrying the same deep signal in a radically transformed body. The Western Maghreb absorbed the wave, Morocco changed, Algeria began to change. The standard model said Tunisia should follow. There are 3 things that happen next. The third one is the one that changes everything. Dr. Mark Lipson and Professor David Reich's 2025 study analyzed 9 individuals from Algeria and Tunisia covering the later Stone Age through the full Neolithic period. What they found in the Eastern Maghreb was unlike anything documented elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. While European farmer ancestry contributed roughly 20% to Western Maghrebi genomes, the populations of Eastern Algeria and Tunisia maintained their pre-Neolithic forager ancestry with a persistence that has no parallel in the European or North African record. They didn't replace them, they went around them. The farming wave, one of the most demographically powerful forces in human prehistory, the wave that replaced or overwhelmed hunter-gatherer populations across most of Europe and the Western Mediterranean, arrived at the Eastern Maghreb, and the local populations absorbed its culture and almost none of its genes. They adopted the sheep, they made the pottery, they continued burying their dead in the old ways, and their genome barely changed. For 9,000 years, these populations sat at the edge of one of history's largest transformations and let it wash around them. Which means that somewhere in the Eastern Maghreb, in Tunisia, in Eastern Algeria, there are communities today whose genomes carry the oldest surviving signal of the ancestral North African ghost lineage. The same lineage that contributed to Basal Eurasian ancestry, the same lineage that fed the farming migration that built Europe. They may not be extinct, they may simply not know what they're carrying. Carrying. That is the only verb that survives 50,000 years of population replacement. The ancient DNA reference database, maintained by researchers at the Max Planck Institute and Harvard, currently holds genomic data from more than 10,000 ancient individuals. When researchers run ancestry models on early European farmers, the people who built the ritual monuments of prehistoric Britain, the megalithic chambers of Brittany, the long barrows that predate Stonehenge, they find a consistent signal running through all of them. Approximately 20 to 25% of their genome traces to a population with near zero Neanderthal ancestry, originating somewhere between North Africa and the Levant. In 2024, Dr. Morten Allentoft of Curtin University in Perth and a large international team published findings in Nature confirming that Basal Eurasian ancestry was already present in Caucasus populations 26,000 years ago, before the last glacial maximum. This lineage was in the Near East before the ice sheets advanced. It survived the glacial period, it fed into the Neolithic farming cultures, it moved into Europe with those farmers. And the Green Sahara data now places the most probable source of that lineage in North Africa itself. So here's the question the data is actually asking. Not, did Africa influence Europe? That's been established. The real question is, what fraction of the genome of a person living today in London or Berlin or Paris traces through the Neolithic farming migration, through the Anatolian corridor, through the Near Eastern farming cultures, all the way back to a lineage that spent the Pleistocene in North Africa? And what happened to that lineage in North Africa after its descendants left? The ancestry that built the farmers who built Europe was not lost when those farmers moved north. It was left behind in North Africa, where it persisted in total isolation for 50,000 years, and then, within a few generations of the late Neolithic, vanished from the continent that created it. Read that again slowly, because it inverts something most people have never questioned. Africa did not export its ancestry to Europe. Europe's ancestry is a copy of an African original, and the original was destroyed by the copy's return. The Iberian farming wave that crossed back into Morocco was carrying a modified version of the very lineage that had originated there, and when it arrived, it replaced the source population that had remained. The copy came home and overwrote the original. There is an Amazigh woman alive today in Tunisia, part of a community that has spoken a continuous language and lived in continuous territory for more than 10,000 years. She carries in her autosomal genome a fraction of the Basal Eurasian signal. She has probably never heard that term, but she is, in a specific and measurable sense, the last known geographic address of a lineage that helped build the world her civilization lives in. The genetic fault line between the populations that absorbed the farming wave and those that resisted it runs almost exactly through the modern borders of the Maghreb, through Tunisia, through eastern Algeria, through the Atlas Range. That line formed 7,000 years ago, and it has not fully resolved. It is still visible in genomic data today. The data is always current. 700 of the Common Era. The Kanem-Bornu Empire begins what will become a 1,200-year existence spanning northern Cameroon, Chad, and the Sahel. Its trade routes extend 2,000 kilometers in every direction. It moves people, merchants, soldiers, tribute carriers, enslaved individuals, across the same genetic fault lines that have been forming and reforming since the Green Sahara. Historical records of the empire are sparse. Historians have known it was powerful. They lacked the tools to prove how far its reach actually extended. The genome gave them the proof. In 2023, Dr. Nancy Bird and Professor Garrett Hellenthal at the UCL Genetics Institute in London published a study using new genetic data from more than 1,300 individuals across 150 ethnic groups in 5 African countries. Their findings, published in Science Advances, showed that genetic traces of the Kanem-Bornu Empire remain in the DNA of people living in Cameroon today, connecting communities separated by over 1,000 kilometers, the genetic signal of a civilization that the written record barely captured. The genome is the archive that empires forgot to burn. The same study found that Cameroon, a country roughly the size of California, contains as much genetic diversity by some measures as the entire continent of Europe. This is not a figure of speech. It is a measurement. Modern humans lived in sub-Saharan Africa for 200,000 years before any population left the continent. The accumulated variation of that time is still sitting in living people. Europe's genetic diversity, vast as it seems from the inside, is a thin slice of what Africa contains. And the Bantu expansion, the most genetically documented migration in sub-Saharan African history, is confirmed by that same research to have been a genuine demographic event, not merely a cultural diffusion. Roughly 1 in 4 Africans speaks a Bantu language today. That language spread because the people speaking it moved. They began in what is now the borderlands of Cameroon and Nigeria, moved east and south over thousands of years, and in their wake, some of the ancient lineages that connected to North Africa's pre-Neolithic past were absorbed or diluted again. This is the recurring pattern of human prehistory, playing out in every direction at once. Something ancient sits in relative isolation. A larger demographic force arrives. The original is partially absorbed, partially displaced, partially preserved in communities at the margins where the wave lost momentum. And the people living in those marginal communities carry genetic evidence of a world that the mainstream populations surrounding them have already forgotten. But there is something else in the North African record, something that has no historical name. Several populations in the Maghreb carry genetic signatures consistent with severe demographic bottlenecks, sharp collapses in population size that cannot be matched to any known historical event. The trauma is in the genome. The catastrophe that caused it has no name in any record we have found. No name, but there may be a face. Tunis, 2025. Geneticists, including researchers from Algeria and Tunisia acknowledged in the Lipson Reich study, are running admixture models on modern Amazigh communities. The question they are asking, does the genetic continuity documented in the ancient Eastern Maghreb have a living address? The early answer is yes. The Lipson Reich 2025 study confirmed that the ancient Maghrebi genetic profile, the forager ancestry that resisted the Neolithic replacement wave, is still present in modern Tunisian and Algerian populations, though substantially diluted over the millennia. In certain highland Amazigh communities, the proportion of pre-Neolithic ancestry is measurably higher than in lowland neighbors living just a few hundred kilometers away. They did not choose to preserve it. They preserved it because, generation after generation, their ancestors chose each other. That is how inheritance works at the population level, not by intention, by proximity. Now, I want to ask you something before we reach the end of this. In the last video, we watched steppe pastoralists sweep through Europe, absorbing almost everything in their path. Here, we've been watching a population that absorbed almost nothing for 9,000 years. Which do you think was the more common pattern in the ancient world? Rapid absorption, or that kind of deep, quiet resistance? Drop your answer in the comments, because honestly, the answer changes what the next 10,000 years of human prehistory look like. Here's what I want you to consider before the final thought. If you carry any ancestry from southern Europe, Spain, Italy, Portugal, the islands of the Western Mediterranean, then a fraction of that ancestry passed through Anatolia. Before Anatolia, it passed through a Near Eastern farming culture. Inside that culture was a lineage that separated from all other humans 50,000 years ago on or near the North African coast. You are not connected to this story as a metaphor. You are connected to it biochemically. The percentage is real. The name for the source population does not yet exist. That 23andMe result, that Ancestry.com report, the 2% that says North African, unspecified, that is not noise. That may be a 50,000-year-old address that the testing industry doesn't have a label for yet. The U6 mitochondrial haplogroup, found in living Amazigh communities across the Maghreb, in descendants of the ancient Guanche people of the Canary Islands, in trace frequencies across the Iberian Peninsula, is the most direct genetic thread running from the ancient North African forager world into the present. A woman in Marrakesh carries it. A man in Tenerife carries it. A family in Andalusia with roots going back further than the documented record carries it. They hold in the maternal line a signal that predates the Neolithic, predates the desert, predates the concept of Africa and Europe as separate things. They carry the witness. They just don't know what it witnessed. If this video changed what you thought you knew about where European and African DNA actually meet, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me, what piece of this didn't you see coming? I read every one. The ghost lineage has no confirmed living home, but it has living carriers. Somewhere in a viewer's genome or a neighbor's or an ancestor's, the oldest surviving thread of the first North African civilization is still being copied, still being passed forward to people who will never know its name. That is not a mystery. That is how inheritance works. You do not choose what you carry. You only choose whether to look.